So we are live. Just a few technical difficulties. Last time, I think it was Michael Tracy's fault, but this time it's my fault. So it all evens out in the end. But from what I can tell, everyone can hear me. So we can go. Um, First off, we have a special guest, and that is Hitler Hated Christ, not our guy on Twitter and on Substack. So, welcome. What should I call you exactly? Maybe I shouldn't
Well,
be saying Hitler hated Christ.
special guest is great if you just keep
Special
calling me
guest.
special guest. No, but,
Okay.
in all seriousness, you can call me Ethan. My first name is Ethan. So,
Ethan.
I
Great.
I went on Jeremy Boring's show 2, 3 weeks ago and, face doxed myself, so everybody knows my real name
We all
now.
know that you are, in fact, a Jew.
That's right, that's
I'm
right.
no, I found someone who I think might even like me was posting that, and I was like, "What are you talking about?" This anyway.
Yeah, there was a guy named I think was it See Through It All on Twitter, and, he
Yes.
was
Yeah.
he was posting my picture and all this, and all the replies were people like, "This is the most, like, SS, Einsatzgruppen commander looking
French.
guy."
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just, like, full on and then that's true, like, I was posting my 23andMe and stuff because it is pretty funny how German I am for what I do on the
Oh,
internet
you're
these
very
days.
German. Okay, that's good.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah.
That is very interesting. Yeah, I saw you on Jeremy Boring's show, and I was pleasantly surprised because I didn't know if you wanted to, step over that obstacle and or boundary and kind of do an interview and things like that. Because some people are kind of more comfortable on Twitter, but I was glad to see it, so I invited you on as well because I think we could have a productive conversation. But before we start, why don't because I'll just lay it out the land here of what I was planning on doing. So I am interested in your perspective on Hitler and Christianity and Catholicism and all that went on, and I think that would be interesting. I'm very interested in your perspective on the religious right. I guess I think maybe these are two things. There's the religious right that has been going on for my entire lifetime, and then there's this new resurgence, at least online, of Christian nationalism, and that is something that I would like to hear your thoughts on. And I think we should go into the Curse of Ham. I mean, it's very timely.
Is
Mr.
that
Part.
something you've been talking about lately, or you've just been
Well,
following it on Twitter?
I've always hated ham. I mean, even with cheese. So I mean, I it's been a long term thing with me. Yeah. But no, I
Right.
saw Joel Webbon's acolyte, uh, Pastor Partridge, I guess is his name. Is I listen as I was hiking this morning up a mountain. I actually listened to his Curse of Ham
Ah,
exegesis, and so I
boy.
thought that would be a very timely one that maybe we could sort of understand larger things by looking at that smaller thing. But before I do that, why don't you tell my audience, who you are, as much about your background as you feel comfortable, just to let them get to know you a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So I started this Twitter account, I guess, maybe 2 or 3 years ago,
Hmm.
and the reason I initially started it was that I was reading a lot of World War II history. I was reading specifically about the intersection between Nazi Germany and theology, because I knew several different guys who were in some very dissident spaces at the time, guys that were involved in groups like Unity in Europa, which turned into American Identity Movement, as you're probably well aware. And was just having probably hundreds of hours in person conversations with these types of guys about the intersection of Christian theology and what had been sort of coined at that time as the alt right all the way back in 2016,
Hmm.
and then has morphed into what we're sort of living through today. And in a lot of these conversations, I just felt there was a lot of there were a lot of beliefs about Hitler and World War II and the ideologies at play there that I knew were probably not accurate, to the historical record, and so that's why I started looking into it, really so I could have these discussions with my friends in real life better, and I created a Twitter account somewhat as a place to just dump all that stuff, and I expected there to be a very small amount of people that really cared about that because I really thought that the theology side of online discourse and the political side of online discourse back then really were not the same spheres. Like, people really didn't go back and forth between those very much. I didn't
Mhm.
see there being much of a interest in that. And then when I created my account, it's like every time I posted some new document from somewhere with some new quotation from Hitler recorded by Goebbels or Rosenberg or somebody else,
Uh,
related to Christianity, it just got more and more traction. And what was odd is I kept running into these weird circles that at that stage were really early in some of the Christian nationalist stuff that we as we know it today, of pastors and commentators and stuff that took issue with my perspective on Hitler and World War II, which is really odd because up until this point, at that point of the process, everybody that I had known had been pretty fringe. Right, I knew these kinda, like,
mhm.
weird guys that these are guys that, were reading Blood and Soil, these are guys that were reading Evola, these are those guys.
Mhm.
And so when I saw individuals like your Dale Partridge or your Joel Webbon or some of these other people, start to have real issue with me online or, like, kinda butt heads with me over some World War II stuff, it was really odd because I was sort of watching in real time these things that I had seen presented by these guys years ago, what I feel like being laundered into Christian spaces and repackaged. Um,
That is
and
interesting. I felt the same thing as well because Joel Webbon and company, they are much more mainstream than maybe you would like to imagine, or certainly than the people who preceded them and sort of got these talking points and ways of thinking going. They've sort of broken through in a way that's remarkable, but they do. I've heard these talking points as well. Like they are sort of rehashing, 2010s Christian or white nationalism, basically.
right, and all the guys back then that I knew that were more into that kinda thing were dudes that were super radical traditional Catholics. In fact, the first time I went to a Catholic church, because 'cause I'm Reformed, but I went to a Catholic church with a friend
Mhm.
of mine, and he was in some of these circles, and he gave me the full spiel on the tradition of the Catholic Church and the unity of the Catholic Church and all this stuff, and I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." And I came to find out later that the church that he had taken me to was actually an SSPX church. And
Oh,
so I
interesting.
I was being presented sort of this view of this unified Catholic faith and also wrapped up in a lot of these, um, I'll call them alt-right positions because at the time that's what they would be referred to as.
Yeah.
Um, and I come to find out that the church that he was presenting to me as being this sort of unified Catholic thing wasn't even in communion, full communion, at least with Rome. So those sort of guys were always around, but seeing it come into especially Protestant circles, seeing it come
Mhm.
into more mainstream evangelicalism in the last couple years, especially, has been very odd to me, because I had dealt with this stuff for so long on the level of basically everybody on my side of the Christian right understanding that they were off base. And now you have like Facebook boomers that are like, well, how do you feel about the Talmud? Like all this stuff. And it's just very
Right.
odd, odd to see that.
It is truly odd. Yeah, things that were very minor 15 years ago that I know about just because of my career's length, are on Facebook now. Yes, it's kind of scary.
Is that just algorithm, or do you think that there's a big like shift that's taken place? Because I
I
seem
think there's
to
a big
I go back
shift.
and forth on that. Okay.
I don't think it's just the algorithm. I mean, I think I can't imagine that the algorithm is seeking out those words exactly. I do think that the algorithm wants to inflame you. So it's finding that. No, I think there's sort of been a long march through the conservative media ecosystem, basically, of things that I would hear at the Charles Martel Society in 2008. And I'm now hearing coming out of the mouth of Webben or other people. It's pretty interesting.
Right. Or like
Um,
Amrin, race doctrine
mhm.
repackaged in an evangelical Christian framework, which is just bizarre because you've got these guys like Webben who are young Earth creationists who are sort of like
Right.
like they're sort of like re-engineering backwards the racial positions of what Amrin was, back then. But
Well, there
with
is a
epigenetics and all, it's just very bizarre, man.
oh my gosh, he's into okay, yeah. That is and there seems to be a trend because even when you mentioned Patriot Front, I mean, I was around, Nathan Damigo and people like that, and I think as early as 2015, definitely 2016. And it was Identity Europa, like EVROPA. Like, it
Right, right, right.
was Nietzschean, Bronze Age maybe, or Evolian, it was all it was very pagan, maybe not in your face, but it was definitely there. And then the identity or American identity movement was a sort of optics, you know, twist on it where it's like, "Oh, no, we're American nationalist." And now I saw a video that I believe was released by, Patriot Front where they're praying there's a red, white, and blue
Oh,
crucifix, which
yeah. Yes.
struck
Yeah,
me as a little bit odd,
they
and they're
branded
they're
it with their colors. It was very really weird.
yeah, I'm offended as a lapsed Episcopalian, I guess, but, it's just, but there was a very congregationalist quality to it all. It's like, "Our leader Thomas, we ask God to bless him and lead him for the truth of Christ and our nation." There seems to be a long-term trend of things emerging among people who, like Amren or Jared Taylor, who, I don't know exactly what Jared Taylor believes, but, fair to say he's agnostic, perhaps an atheist or so on. Definitely from an
And pro-abortion.
evolutionary.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, again, I don't know exactly. I'm just saying it's fair to say he's an agnostic. He's a
Right.
secular guy. And and things start and as I was too in 2016, unquestionably, and still am. But so you have it start there and then it kind of morphs into a Christian congregation. And I've seen this a number of times where I think it's a trend or maybe I wouldn't say inevitable, but there seems to be a path that it travels, and I find that interesting.
Yeah, I think I mean, there are a lot of people that were probably in evangelical spaces, grew up, as evangelicals, who what they saw was their interests and what really invigorated them on the internet started to they that they realized was not in step with their Christianity, and rather than sort of bring their politics in line with their Christianity, they were like, "Well, let's bring Christianity in line with the stuff that
Right.
really, the Crusader meme and whatever on the internet."
Right.
And, that's been a weird thing even in reform circles that I run in, because there's this whole discussion. You've got guys with Jerusalem cross and all this stuff.
Mhm.
And traditionally, as reform guys, the Crusades were not something that we looked upon positively, right? I mean, promising salvation, for going and dying in a war was not exactly compatible with a Calvinistic soteriology, right? That just doesn't
Right.
work.
Yeah. Uh, very interesting stuff, but, that does seem to be where we are, and also the evangelical Christians or the Christians right in my lifetime were so enthusiastic about George W. Bush, and I think they had maybe their own heresies during the 2000s. Where they were in charge, even on domestic policy, they were at least consulted for the compassionate conservatism that George W. Bush promised. And they were the last defenders of, in every human heart, there's a Democrat waiting to get out. And we don't mean of the party, we mean a true blue American. I'm reminded of a line that I guess I won't repeat from Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, but within every you know what, there's an American just waiting to get out. And they were the sort of last believers in that missionary posture that America was in at the time. And that went away and was demoralized. And they weren't quite sure about Trump at the beginning, probably more back in 2015, 2016, maybe more in line with Cruz, Trump. Who is he? Does he support abortion? Is he really Christian? Is he a philandering sex maniac? Fair questions.
Right.
But they really did get on board, and by 2020, the Paula White is speaking in tongues to save the election, and now this sort of post-Trump Christian nationalist movement, they might criticize Trump, and they do, to be fair, and they're not in favor of the war in Iran, et cetera, but they're coming in the wake of Donald Trump, and I think they're sort of promising, like, full-throated Trumpism, Trumpism without Trump that's beyond Trump and even Trumpier than Trump, and, so it's an interesting it's an interesting phenomena.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of those people that you're describing sort of absorb the there's no political solution idea. And so when
Mhm,
they won politically with Trump, or in 2016, and then more recently, um, they sort of turned around and were like, "Oh, I've been saying there's no political solution. I can't really change my mind now." And this is one thing that my friend John Harris mentioned. Just I was listening to his show earlier today, talking about
mhm,
Patriot Front, where it's really odd. Where if you look at it electorally, if you look at it in terms of policy, there's a lot of wins that have happened with Trump from the right wing um,
mhm,
in the last year or more. And it's very odd for your normal GOP voter, like I think about like my dad, who's a boomer GOP guy, to see all these Patriot Front people marching on Washington, and they've got upside down American flags. And it's like, well, who's in power right now? What is the deal here? And
right.
it's sort of just revolution at any cost. It has this real vitality to it, in the sense that everybody's really excited. But the issue I have largely with it is I don't know what they're excited for. I can't get a lot of these guys to explain to me what they really want to do in terms of policy.
Mhm,
Um, Webben and a lot of that sphere will go out and say all of the same rhetoric that I heard from the alt right back then,
mhm,
about mass deportations and stuff like that, sort of hint, hint, nudge, nudging even beyond just illegals. Obviously, deport 100 million, but no, none of those guys will have a conversation about what that means in terms of policy, right? Is the actual policy goal here? We're just going to deport all nons. Like, is that really what the plan is, right?
mhm.
Um, and I haven't seen any of these guys in that sect or sphere have that conversation. And I don't know if it's because they're all just sort of hiding a power level right now, or what the thinking is. But there has to be an end game to it. There has to be a shift. But maybe there's not. Maybe it's all just totally reactionary slop. I don't know yet.
Yeah. I don't wanna bash Patriot Front the whole time, but there is a sort of, like, "What are you doing? What do you want?" question that comes up, and I understand, at least I don't think they're a bunch of federal agents, to be fair, but I
No,
understand
definitely.
sort of why Fox News viewers would think that, and it's a, like, are you protesting Trump? Like, is that why you're doing this? You're making a demonstration against the government? Is this a Trump cheerleading squad? What do you want? Reclaim America? What does that really mean? You sound like you're saying Republican talking points on some level of, strong families and so on, and then on another level, there does seem to be a little bit of a revolutionary verve to it, but none of it is articulated, and so it does become a goulash, and they seem to sort of do it for the sake of doing it. Like, we've got to go. It's This is my community. We go in March, but it's like, well, there's some downsides of marching, and second, and then B, I don't a protest without something to be a protest without a target.
Right.
It's kind of like a word that doesn't reference anything in the real world. It's just gibberish. And I think, yeah, I'll stop bashing Patriot Front because I don't want to make it about this and so on. But I do get a lot of these vibes. Like, I don't know where this goes. I don't know where this would go in a, coming Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom administration, or I don't know where, I don't know what the hell they're doing. That's
Yeah. No, and I agree with you. I mean, that's kind of my perspective on it. I had posted I went into their telegrams and pulled some of their content that was promotional material for their group, and
Mhm.
a lot of the stuff that they do, and I guess you don't want to bash Patriot Front, so we can move on. You could control whatever you want to move on to, but
If you
um,
can
oh,
you do a little bit.
okay,
I'm just saying I don't want this to be some, like, we're just,
right.
dunking on people who aren't here to,
I
defend
understand.
themselves.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's fair enough. But one of the things I had posted was just how many how many of their self-promotional videos consist of just vandalism, right?
Mm.
And it's like going out and spray painting the sides of buildings. I think some of them are government buildings. Some of it was like glass on phone booths and stuff. And I was like, I posted it and I was like, what does this remind you of? And somebody replied and told me, and they were like, it reminds me of Coney 2012.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I was like, "That's actually really interesting." Where it's like, this it's sort of driven by this. I've been really invigorated by this thing on the internet that's a cause, but I don't really know what I want other than just like to
Yeah.
make it known, you know?
Mhm. I mean, I went to Africa and fought on behalf of Coney. I was so invigorated by that YouTube video. Yeah. It was a while ago. I survived. He was actually the bad guy. I forgot. Wasn't he? Or he was the good guy? I forget.
Yeah, no, no, he was a bad guy. Coney, he
Oh,
was
it's
like an
even funnier
African
that I fought on
warlord.
his behalf.
That's what
I
I thought the joke was.
misunderstood the video and
Oh, okay, yeah.
and
Well, when you
volunteered for
advocate for the
Coney's side.
Antichrist, I don't know what really, what you're gonna say.
Right. That's true. That's true. What do you think the status of Christianity and nationalism is? And maybe I'll like on a deeper level, maybe I'll set this up here with some of my thoughts about it. I think that I don't think that Martin Luther set out to create a nationalist movement. However, I do think that a lot of nationalist energies were present in his Reformation and certainly came in the wake of it. He wanted to reform the Catholic Church. He did not want to end the Catholic Church or leave it. And one complaint among many others that are strike me as quite reasonable is that the German lands aren't represented in this monopolistic Italian church, and we sort of need our day in the sun. And there are, clear elements of a I don't it's maybe too strong a word, but like a decolonization effort that went alongside Protestantism where and you can see how this works. It's about, well, I don't need some priest off in Rome telling me what to do. We can do this for ourselves. And we as a community can read the Bible and reach Christ without you. And Henry VIII, I mean, his motives might not have been uh, sinless, I guess, but regardless, the founder of my church, I always ask myself, what would Henry do? Whenever I'm in any situation, what would Henry do? But yeah, but he again, even whatever his motives might have been, and they might have been venal, he nevertheless created a Britain that was separate from Rome and that had its day in the sun. So I think again, I don't think that Luther set out to create nationalism. However, nationalism followed alongside it. And I'll just add on one more thing here. I think a lot of I think a lot of American nationalism has been explicitly sometimes, but definitely implicitly Protestant nationalism. There's a book that I read 10 years ago. I'm his name was like it was a simple name like Robert Smith or something. Although not of the Cure, but it was called the White Protestant Nation or something like this. The Anyway, his thesis was that there was this sort of consensual, implicit Protestantism that defined 20th century America. And we seem to be losing this. And he is speaking as a Protestant, where he thinks it's a tragedy on some level, but maybe on another level, it's an opportunity to rediscover what Christianity really means. And so there has been an implicit Protestantism at the heart of American nationalism. But these are just some of my thoughts on the matter. What do you think the status of Christianity and nationalism is? Like, how do these things interact? Are they antipodal? Are they? What do you think?
That's a good question. So, I mean, I don't have a lot of background historically in Luther and the early or proto Reformation stuff. So I can't really
Hmm.
speak on that level, to be honest, with any competency. What I see happening now is you have some old guard guys who are what we would consider or called general equity theonomists, and these are guys that want to see some moral precepts that are in things like the Old Testament integrated into the government, whether on the state level or
Mm.
the federal government. These are guys that want that, and those are your
Like
your Doug
Rushdoony,
Wilsons.
yeah.
Yeah.
Rushdoony, I think, was the major
Yes,
or
yeah, he
early
was a big
writer of
guy.
this, but yeah.
Yeah, he was a big guy, and he's a little bit out there even still because I mean, my understanding is he didn't take communion for a really long time as well, and a lot of
Mm.
these guys that were in the early part of this were pretty fringe, and it got brought into some more mainstream apologetic stuff by Doug Wilson, who really popularized all that, and he kinda still
Hmm.
leads that sphere. You familiar with Doug? Um,
Yes,
yeah, so
and he's
Hegseth
in
is
the
part of his
mainstream right.
church
He's,
network.
yeah.
Yes, yes, he spoke at Turning Point and all this, and so he represents sort of what I think is the most realistic and grounded, and also um, from a my perspective on Christian morality, most acceptable form of Christian nationalism.
Hmm.
Um, to I guess you could call it the right of him, you have this middle sphere of people, kind of like I mentioned earlier, your Dale Partridge, Webb and Co. People like that, Jack Posobiec, and who is the Torba would be kind of in this zone where they want Christian nationalism, but what they really mean by Christian nationalism is just having a Christian authoritarian government, right?
Mm.
Whatever that sort of means, whatever strikes you as being haha based, as it would have been interpreted in 2016. That's what they want in regards to an actual governmental future for the U.S. And then beyond them, you've got your full-on guys that really integrate some of the more racial component to this into it. You get your CI guys, you get a lot of your weirdos.
Mhm.
Even beyond them, in the church as it stands in real life, which is very different from this whole network online, there's a lot of people that claim to be Christian nationalists merely just because they are right leaning Christians that do believe that their moral precepts should have the opportunity to be advocated for publicly, and that they ought not be denigrated for that in their voting. Like if they say, I'm going to vote for this guy because he's a Christian and I think he's going to do X, Y, and Z because of a Christian, they want to be able to say that culturally. They want that to be culturally acceptable. And they don't even know about all the rest of the baggage that comes along with some of these other groups and that kind of thing.
Mm.
And then there's other evangelicals that will look in and see this stuff and think, this is really just nuts. There's still a very strong libertarian contingent in the evangelical right in this country, especially in Baptist circles. I'm not sure how much you paid attention to interdenominational politics and stuff, but Baptists especially have this perspective where um, the state really needs to be leaving the church alone, but that also means the church needs to be leaving the state alone, because as soon as
Mm.
we start to integrate certain Christian beliefs explicitly into the government, then the government has some sort of doctrinal control over the local church. And that's what they're primarily afraid of. I think that's a legitimate concern. I'm somewhere between those people and Doug Wilson, probably, in my personal belief.
Mhm.
But out beyond all of that, you've got the really fringe guys who, from what I can tell, just really aren't represented in real life churches much at all. Like most of the time I hear about this in my church or other folks' churches that talk to me, it's one individual that sort of drifts in and is very obsessed with some sort of weird internet thing nobody understands, and then later drifts out because he becomes Eastern Orthodox or becomes,
Mhm.
SSPX Roman Catholic or whatever. So that's kind of the general landscape, insofar
Does
as I see
Joel
it.
Webben how revolutionary are they? And I don't ask this as some sort of implied criticism. I'm genuinely
Right.
curious. Like, do do they wanna throw the Constitution out the window? Like, and we're gonna establish something new? Or do they simply, when I speak with Nick Fuentes, I don't think he wants to do that. And I think he wants Christians in charge, and I think he's even said, like, we would tolerate people like me or something. I don't know.
Apolloans don't throw in jail immediately, I guess.
Exactly. Yes, we're a minority community. We have our little festivals, and We do
You're
marches in
like
New
the
York
Amish.
City, maybe.
You're the Amish. Yeah, you
Exactly,
get
yeah,
to do your
maybe,
thing.
yeah. I could think of other analogs, but, what so, w how revolutionary are they? Like, from what you can tell, like, the people who call themselves Christian nationalists, what do they want?
Well, that's kind of what I was talking about earlier, where it's very difficult to nail down what they want in terms of policy because they don't engage in most of that rhetoric, that back
Mhm,
and forth. They when things like the constitutionality of something are brought up, there's usually the general like chuckle of like, haha, that's silly. Like, why would that matter? Right.
mhm,
If we get our Christian prince, the vibe is if we get our Christian prince, then it's kind of irrelevant. Right. And so that's where this sort of authoritarian or more aptly, I guess, would be somewhat totalitarian side of
mhm,
it comes into it. Um, you've got some guys like your Corey Mallers and some of those dudes that will maybe lay out a more specific view for a Christian prince to come in and rule with an iron fist and get rid of the Constitution or whatever.
mhm,
Um, a lot of these guys aren't really even thinking about it on that level, and it's not even me trying to denigrate guys like Webben.
mhm,
I just think you have to understand too, quite a few of these guys have only become aware of these sort of talking points on the dissident right in the last couple 2 or 3 years, right?
mhm,
Um, I found sermons from Webben from 4 or 5 years ago talking about, racism being a sin and all these things. And so it's new to them, and it's going to take time to figure out where they exactly land um, in regards to policy advocacy. But that's not really why people like them. People aren't tuning into Joel Webben to get his take on the Constitution and
mhm,
how he will enact his Christian government. Right. That's what Doug Wilson gets grilled on by NPR, but it's not what these guys in the middle area there sort of have their audience for. They're largely reactionary, hyper conspiratorial type guys. They draw a
mhm,
similar strain of people to the moms that watch Candace Owens, but just on the
mm.
guy side and with a mixture of 4chan. That's kind of my feeling.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't want to go into it, but yeah, the white suburban mom as a Candace fan is a very surprising thing. I don't think that was Alex Jones's audience, but Candace has broken new
Has gotten
ground.
it. She figured it
Yeah,
out. She found the
eh,
green space in that area for sure.
yeah. But so was is Jesus a nationalist? I mean, I think Jesus as he is depicted in the Gospels, is he a nationalist? I mean, I think I've always come to Jesus throughout my life as some sort of I don't some sort of liberal hippie. I mean, if I'm honest, um, I don't see nationalism. I don't see borders. I don't see calling ICE agents on your neighbors. I don't. He was given an opportunity to stone a woman caught in flagrante being an adulteress. And what does he do? He forgives her. He tells her to sin no more, but he forgives her. Isn't this a truer essence of Jesus Christ than an authoritarian or a Christian prince? Like, isn't there a radical, in many ways, message to Jesus that is totally at odds with nationalism?
Well, so totally at odds is a pretty strong way of phrasing it, but I would say, I mean, there's two sort of ends of this. So Christ did not come to be a political ruler, and that's
Hmm.
that's really broadly agreed upon. The question then becomes, he didn't come to be a political ruler, um, which means he also didn't speak about political matters explicitly, right?
Hmm.
So that there's a lot of room for personal revelation or interpretation regarding your personal political beliefs in the New Testament gospel. All while trying to, at least in the evangelical world, reflect Christ in all of those different domains as being the highest good for that. It kind of it cuts both ways because he didn't come to be a ruler. You can't say, okay, well, Jesus came to like crush all his enemies and instantiate some sort of authoritarian state, obviously. But because he didn't do that, he also wasn't talking about things we would consider explicitly political, right? All his parables reduce things down to individuals and their individual relationships. What is a Samaritan to the man who was found on the road, right? What is that, right?
Mhm.
One thing that is interesting is, recruiting zealots to be apostles. That's interesting, right? That's an interesting idea. What does that mean for overcoming political barriers? And historically, in my lifetime, I guess, but more than historically, it seems as if your mainstream evangelical conservative Christians are comfortable with things like strong border policy and all that because they feel like Christ is pretty silent on that sort of topic specifically.
Mhm.
However, the moral precept positions still remain in Christ's teachings. And how those are enacted through the government is going to vary from person to person. What you never find is any sort of leeway for, the voice of the people is the voice of God, or some of these later concepts that really tie the idea of the state as being the collective soul of the people, and some of the more philosophical stuff around nationalism. That stuff I think has to be bolted on, and
Right.
definitely isn't really compatible. So
Right. I guess I'll just put this another way. I don't you think there's something true about the theological work known as Jesus Christ Superstar by Andrew Lloyd Webber? I mean that seriously. Like,
I've never seen it, so you have to explain. Sorry.
oh, okay. Well, it's actually good. I like it. Jesus Christ Superstar. Who and what do you think you are? And there's Judas has some great, arias. Or songs. It's a rock opera by Andrew Lloyd Webber. I don't know what to tell you. You should listen to it. But it came out in the, I think, late 70s, like 1978, and it's it's getting at what I was saying, that 60s hippie Jesus. Like, isn't and I it seems like a lot of people who come to Christianity, they want to come to for the basedness, and they want to cast out sluts and judge
Right,
people.
right,
and
right.
and and to be fair, in the Gospels, Jesus is deeply immoral. It's not, if you have lust in your heart, that is the equivalent of uh, cheating on your wife. It's deeply intentional, and so on. So I get that, but it just seems like Jesus, as a man fairly depicted in the Gospels, is very compatible with a lot of these people that Christian nationalists hate, which is the liberal hippie type, or the person who's helping out the homeless, the kind of visionary smoking a little weed and you know getting to the truth with his friends around a campfire. I mean, I've just I you can s- I've always had that impression of Jesus, and it's never changed, because even when I read the gospels more seriously, I like Jesus in many ways. But I don't see Doug Wilson in Jesus. Jesus is about as far away from that as possible. Actually, I do see a kind of, not a political. Yeah, maybe in Revelation there's a kind of theocratic politics that's coming, or has been, or who knows. But it just seems like, in the character that is plainly depicted, um, he is so much closer to being a revolutionary and a rock star and a weirdo, maybe, than whatever it is that Christian nationalists want. I mean, I feel that in some ways Jesus has to be defended against his greatest offenders. That he is something different, and I you might not like this, but I would connect him with the other man who could turn water into wine and whose blood was wine. I think there's a deep, deep connection between Jesus and Dionysus, in fact. And it just seems like the Christian nationalists miss this. You don't have to become a mythicist or anything like that, but they seem to just miss some crucial radical element to Jesus. Maybe this
Okay,
is
well, that
me.
was a no, no. I mean, that was a lot. So give me a minute here. So
Sure.
I the Dionysus stuff. I'm like, that's you know, that's in left field for me. I'm gonna have to just say, like, maybe table that one, buddy.
Okay.
But I will say that, there is something to be said in Christ has overwhelming compassion on sinners.
Yeah.
And even in the parable of the unforgiving servant, you've got this concept that's, very very prevalent, of the idea that somebody who is forgiven much and feels indebted to Christ, holding another person accountable for those debt for their own, those other debts that they have, is perverse. Like, Christ seems to have exhibit, that he has real, issues with people who live their life that way. So there's an
Mhm.
aspect of that that's true, but the thing about the gospel is, in my view as a Christian, is it's the perfect synthesis of the mercy and the mercy and grace with the upholding of the moral law, right? Because
Mhm.
you don't have any gospel without the belief that all persons deserve to burn in hell forever in eternal conscious torment. You don't have that, right? The
Right.
gospel doesn't have any power if that's removed from the equation. If all Jesus did was come and be a really cool dude smoking weed, bro, like, you don't have the power of the cross. You don't have that sacrifice, that penal substitutionary atonement, to use
Mhm.
like a real nerdy theological phrase. You don't have that unless you also have law. And Christ's character, as we Christians see it, is that he was the perfect embodiment of both of those things. And
Mhm.
if to someone that appears hippie, it may be because they have a false impression in one direction, and if to someone else that appears to be an authoritarian in some weird sense, it may be that they're actually viewing it kind of a little bit too far the other direction.
Mhm.
So, and I'm speaking of people who, in that case, would be Christians. But this is a dynamic that I think Christians have recognized for a long time, that, everyone who is a believer perceives Christ as sort of a different figure in their life. Is Christ a rabbi or a teacher to you, right? Is Christ a um, a refuge for you in your difficulties? Is Christ,
Mhm.
a conqueror? These are all things that I believe Christ does represent in the Gospels. Um, but depending on your personality and depending on what we would call, I guess, in Christianity, how much idolatry you have, you can reinterpret, you can eisegetically look at Scripture and reinterpret him to be whatever you want. You can really
Mhm.
do that if you want to. Not that you can do it. You're allowed to do that, I guess, in Christian doctrine, but you are capable of doing that, and people have been doing that for many many hundreds of years. So
Yes. Yeah. I mean, he's the lion and the lamb. I think there's a interesting moment in Revelation where John, the other John of Patmos, what is it? He's looking for a symbol of the lion, and then it kind of fades away, and it's the lamb. And I think it's telling you that it's both. There's a dual quality to Jesus, that which is why he's so complex and so interesting. Um,
yeah, well, and in the
yeah.
Book of Life and stuff, there's a lot of stuff in the Old Testament, or sorry, in Revelation, that refers back to the
Hmm.
Old Testament. This is one of the reasons why I had a conversation with Arval, the Return to the Land guy, who you may be
Hmm.
familiar. I think I'm sure
Oh
you're
yeah.
familiar with, rather.
Yes.
And he believes in such a harsh disconnect from Pauline theology and the Old Testament, as well as some other things, and that's just not how I read Scripture. I have a covenant theology belief, and so my view is that there's so many different symbols and values that sort of flourish in the Old Testament and come to their fulfillment in the New, and are exhibited in things like Revelation. And so there's a lot going on with that. So, you did mention John, of Patmos. Are you convinced you're not talking about like the apostle there, or you're just trying to be? Have you
Oh,
looked
I
into
do
that
you
at all?
think that the same John who wrote the Gospels, who wrote the Gospel of John, wrote Revelation? I guess that is what they said at the Nicaea Council.
Yeah.
I
So there's
Okay,
different
well, it's
arguments on
fine
that,
if you
both
believe,
directions.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I probably wouldn't agree with that, but yeah, it's alright.
I fair enough. Right. He does just call. I mean, he just identifies himself as John. He seems to think everybody thinks who he knows who he's talking about.
Right. I think they're 2 different guys, but we don't need to split hairs. So, is Jesus a Jew? I'll just leave it at
Oh
that because
yeah. Yeah. I
there's a
mean,
lot
yeah. But
there, and you can answer yes and no, which I think is fair.
yes. No, Jesus is a Jew.
Mhm.
What that means is what people mean by Jew today, realistically. And when someone says someone
Mhm.
is Jewish today, broadly, they are talking about somebody who is ethnically Jewish, right? Because if there are people who are secular Jews, extremely nominal Jewish background, whatever. In fact, a huge amount of Christians that convert from who are ethnically Jewish that convert to Christianity today refer to themselves as Christian Jews. Like they don't lose this
Hmm.
sort of Jewish ethnic identity by becoming Christians necessarily. Um, they recognize that there is a disconnect between the religious beliefs of most of their ethnic, kinfolk or whatever. But they still retain the fact that they are ethnically, racially, genetically Jewish. And that is required for Christ, given his lineage in Scripture to fulfill prophecy and everything else. Um, so one of the weird things that's been happening lately is that people will really object to the idea of someone saying like, "Well, Jesus was is a Jew," and it's very odd because the argument for that is this idea that when people say Jew, what they really mean is some sort of post Second Temple rabbinic Talmudic Jew, and I don't think that's really what people mean ever when they say Jesus is a Jew.
Hmm.
That's just not what anybody in evangelical spaces believes, from what I understand. I never grew up in evangelical spaces being at all given the impression that anyone thought that people that just happened to be ethnically Jewish somehow were saved or were Christians by the fact of their genes or whatever, um, or that people in the Old Testament were practicing some sort of bizarre, second, third century Talmudic stuff. That's just not what's going on. But I think
Hmm.
people are they don't like that Jewish label, and so there's been an effort to, I guess, strip Christ of that, which really does sync up pretty well with some of the bizarre um, Nazi positive Christianity stuff that I've looked into quite a bit. So
Hmm. Well, I don't think you can understand him outside of Judaism 100%. And I think he understood to the degree that it's historically accurate. I think Jesus understood himself as a Jew as well. And in Alexandria, the Substack group, we've been doing a lot of reading. We actually read Martin Luther recently, and who declared before his more flamboyant, on the Jews and their lies. He actually wrote an essay on Jesus. Jesus wasn't born a Jewish man, I believe is the title. So he was very clear about that. We actually read Paul's letter to the Romans, and it's an interesting thing because it's complex and maybe arguably uh contradictory, because there's one view that many people have that's reasonable, I guess, which is like, look, you were the chosen people, but when Jesus walked on earth, that's over. Even if you were chosen, it's now irrelevant. You're no longer chosen anymore. And we might have, in Christians are the new Israel, we've replaced you, and so on. But Paul, I mean, 9:11 in Romans, he's saying something very different than that and more complex. And he accepts the fact that perhaps much like God hardened the heart of the Pharaoh, he's hardened the hearts of many of these Jewish holdouts who just won't accept Christ. That might be true, but at the same time, like, it's going to be even better when they all become Christians. And it's not
right when they finally
something,
return,
yeah, it's not something to be sorry about. And the metaphor of you're being grafted onto their tree, in effect, and it's still their tree. And even within the contradiction of, they're rejecting their own Messiah. I mean, it's a very complex argument. It is persuasive, but it does have a little bit of that contradiction. But I think, you could say the same for a lot of great thinkers, that the contradiction is what makes it interesting. But the only thing that I would say simply after reading uh, Paul's letter to the Romans is, uh, yeah, I can see, I can understand Christian anti-Semitism from the perspective of Christianity, of you rejected God, you killed him, you're a bunch of bastards. I can get why people would act like that. But that's not what is being directly stated in the Bible. And it's more complex, but in so many ways, you are being grafted onto their tree. and you can't lose sight of that. And so I do think, all of these things considered, um, Christian anti-Semitism is a contradiction in terms, or should be impossible.
Yeah, I think that, funnily enough, your interpretation of Romans is actually probably more in line with mine than a lot of people that are in professed Christian nationalists at this point. Um, the funny thing too is you've got Romans 11:18, um, which is very high emphasis on, you mentioned those branches. Those branches are cut off from Christ. You've been grafted in. The root is still that, and then
Mhm.
you have Paul going on to say, but boast not against the branches, that have been cut off. And there's this idea that's presented also um, that they will eventually be grafted back in. Now, that isn't to say all of them will be or whatever, but there's this belief that, and this is tied up in things that we would call the Great Puritan Hope and all these things that historic reformers believe, Protestant reformers, that the Jews would ultimately come back in mass to Christ. Now, what that means, I don't know in terms of that gets crazy eschatological and very speculative. But the boast not against the branches is very valid. And that's another thing that I would love to ask some of these guys that I haven't had the ability to or the opportunity to is if if going online and saying you're a Christ killer and Christ is king, you hate Christ, you're gonna burn in hell, whatever, yada yada yada, to Jews is not boasting against the branches, I guess what would be?
Yeah.
Um, right? What would that even look like? And that's one of those things that I just don't think is going to be addressed in the current political paradigm. But it has been forced by a lot of these types into the theological. And as more and more people that are just normal, everyday Christians are becoming aware of this discourse, a lot of the folks that read the Bible, reads Romans, and especially Reformed people, are running into things like Romans 11:18 and saying, "Hold on, what does this mean to not boast against the branches?" Right? There has long been eschatological differences regarding um, if we would refer to the people, the genetic ethnic grouping of Israel today as being God's chosen people. Um, that's fine either direction. I think that you can make a case from Scripture both ways from that.
Mhm.
What you can't what I don't think you can make a argument from scripture from is a sort of triumphalist joy in denigrating, Jewish people. That's just not it's not in there. It's not what Paul did. I don't think it's the perspective of the New Testament. I mentioned this on Jeremy Boring sort of in passing, but I had a conversation with a guy on Twitter a while back where he used as a proof text for how he could be triumphalistic against the Christ killers of Pilate washing his hands after convicting Christ and saying like this blood is on you guys. And what's so odd of that to me with that is I've always read that as I'm Pilate and that I'm pretending that I'm somehow guiltless, but I'm really not.
Mm.
And so the fact that some have tried to take passages like that and transform them into this perspective of, um, you know, Pilate was innocent, like all the Pilate and Romans, all the quote unquote Aryans are innocent, but the Jews are the ones who are really bearing that guilt is very odd, and um, I don't think it has any legs to stand on. So
Yes. Um, so let's talk a little bit about race, and I can bring up some of these ideas put forward by Partridge that I've looked into this. If we go back to the sons of Noah, there's a lot going on here. We have three sons of Noah, and those are Shem, Japheth, and Ham. And traditionally, this was done theologically. This was even done in the realm of anthropology, actually, as well, in hard sciences. They are taken as avatars or originators of the three great races, you could say. Ham being African, Japheth being Aryan, European, thereabouts, and Shem being Semites. Now, Shem is the origin of the word Semite. When you're anti Semitic, you're anti Shem, so to speak. Now, first off, do you do you agree with that? Do you think that that is what the Bible is saying?
in terms of the racial breakdown of those brothers and what that actually
Yes.
turned into and how we understand it today. So, interestingly enough, I have not come to the conclusion that that is what's being communicated there. There is
Okay.
evidence that historic reformers did believe this to be the case, and that that is part of church tradition.
Mhm.
Because I do hold to a much more sola scriptura perspective on these things. I don't see how that can be shown from scripture directly at all. Um, but that seems to be a consensus that that is the breakdown. You have some weird stuff in there as well, like dwelling in like Japheth, I think it's Japheth dwelling in the tents of Shem, I think is part of
Yes.
that. And so that's like, ooh, what does that mean? Because if we're going to start to interpret these things as being, eternal, um, you know, blessings or prophecy, then that has some implications as well that doesn't get touched.
I
Um,
I mean, I know this sounds crazy to say, but it's almost like they're predicting Christianity, like where Europeans will sort of dwell in the 10th of Shem. I I mean,
are you
yes.
crazy or is it just true? I don't know.
I don't
I mean,
know.
I think I
I
know, but I don't know.
Well, I mean, for instance, do you think there's a racial component to Jacob and Esau? I mean, I know that it's sort of weird to say this because if you just take a literalist reading of the Bible, you're like, Jacob and Esau, of course they're the same race, they're in the same womb and so on, but they're clearly really different figures. And actually God himself says, two nations dwell in your womb. So he's telling you to read it in this way. And I think we can imagine which is which. Esau, my favorite, Esau. He's a jock. He's, goes out and hunts. He's hairy. He's just a cool guy. He wore pit vipers as it says in the text. And, he surfed. He was a very cool guy. Jacob is going to be the line that will lead to Judah and thus Judaism. And so I think I mean, is this what I'm saying here? Is this reading? Does this go against your beliefs, or is
Well, the
this
Jacob
how
and
you would read them?
s so the Jacob and Esau side of things, I understand what you're talking about in terms of nations. I have never I've actually really never even heard that pressed as a racial point before as much as Noah's sons. So
Right. Okay.
that's
Uh-huh.
interesting to me. I haven't seen that in historic reform commentary or anything like that.
Mhm.
Um, that may just mean I'm ignorant on it, to be fair.
Mhm.
In terms of Noah's sons, like I said, there was a consensus view that this is the case to some extent. Where that's really found, at least I don't think it's according to scripture. I think that there are a lot of things that might have been sort of, for lack of a better word, memes in theological history that will arise. An example of this, I think, actually is the idea of the curse of Ham rather than the curse of Canaan.
Mhm.
Because if you recall in that passage, Canaan is cursed, and then Ham is like not blessed later by Noah.
Yes.
Yeah, and so it's a little bit odd because there you'll read commentators like Matthew Henry is one that I like a lot, and on his commentary of that Genesis chapter where this occurs, he does it. He seems to not indicate this idea that Canaan's curse goes backward into Ham and then onward into all of Ham's descendants. But then later, Matthew Henry sort of offhandedly references, I think, in Jeremiah. Somebody sent me this the other day that he did believe in he calls it the curse of Ham, essentially. And I don't
Mm.
know how much of that's because it was really extrapolated from an eisegetical reading of scripture and how much of this was just a general referential meme idea. And part of what the Reformation tradition is finding all of these things that we consider to be things that have been bolted on to the text of scripture and considered to be true and like
Getting rid
kind
of
of
them. Yeah.
yeah, getting rid of those things, right? And
Yeah.
and we believe that's the case even with regard to the Marian dogmas and
Mm.
certain things in that area that we would associate with Catholicism, but even the reformers believed in I believe the perpetual virginity of Mary. And now essentially no reformed
Interesting.
Protestants believe in that. And that would be the idea of
Jesus had a
like the separate
brother, by the way.
yeah, well, exactly, right. Well, that's what's so funny is and
Right.
Jordan who's in this chat he's gonna hate me for this, but I do think it's funny that the Catholics read the, um, the Last Supper as a literal, "This is my body," meaning bread, but then it
Mhm.
says very plainly that, Jesus' brothers, and that must be cousins, right? That's sort of a an interesting little disconnect, I guess, but,
Mhm.
regardless, I do think that there is a church history case to be made for the idea of them being the fathers of these races. I don't think that that case can be made directly from scripture. So, but I haven't looked into it enough to be able to give you a super firm answer on that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I remember reading Genesis for the first time, kind of all the way through and reading it seriously, as opposed to hearing a choice quotation from a pastor or priest or something. When I was in college at the University of Virginia, and it was actually in the English department, and so we read it as literature. And I remember even then this passage of then Ham looked upon the nakedness of his father, and then when
Right.
Noah awoke and he saw what Ham had done to him, and the interpretation of my professor, I believe his name was Nornberg. Anyway, um, was that there's these ellipses in the Bible. So there are these there's fragments in the Bible where you're placing things together. It's basically the documentary hypothesis, but there's also ellipses where something has been taken out because it was too salacious. So looking upon the nakedness of your father sounds creepy, strange. And then once he saw what had been done to him, seems to affirm the fact that something occurred.
Right.
And I had not even until I listened to Pastor Partridge, I didn't know that there was a long tradition analyzing this. But some say that he castrated his father, so we get a little Saturn and Uranus going on there, which is very interesting. Some say he did homosexual acts with his father, gross, and then some. I didn't know this, but there's I guess one interpretation would be that looking upon the nakedness of your father was the equivalent of having incest with your mother. It's getting sorry. This is very
Yeah, it's a
put a
no, no, yeah,
PG-13 rating on this
it's an
podcast
argument
here.
from idiom. Yeah, it's like
Right,
whether if it's an idiom to me, like if you say someone slept with somebody, you don't mean they
right.
just like both spent the night in vicinity. You mean they
Oh,
had
so
sex,
that's
right?
what they meant. Oh, okay. I see.
Right.
Um,
So that's yeah, there's a whole debate on exactly what that means, and I think that given also historic commentators have disagreed forever, it's not there's no consensus on it.
right.
Whatever it is that was a sin, right? That is
Something
all.
bad
Yeah.
happened. Yes, and no question. And Ham did it. And then Ham is not blessed. And so if you assume that Ham, who's interesting, he's the uh ancestor of Cush, etc., that these and the Cushites are pretty clearly Egyptians, Africans. In Exodus, I
Yes.
mean, Moses marries a
Yes.
Cushite woman, and that freaks
That's
out
probably the
his,
firm that's probably the firmest
relatives.
one that you could tie to a racial group, I think would be that one, to be
Right,
honest.
so there
Yeah.
is a line, it's maybe not directly stated, and so, Partridge's reading of this is that, Ham the Africans did something really bad, we don't quite know what it was, back in the day, and the direct descendants, the Canaanites who are gonna be, displaced, by Israel eventually, they're cursed, but Ham is cursed for all time, and this is why I mean, it's a sort of, like, almost magical reading of the problem, with African Americans in schools or with Africa and economic development. It's like it's not evolution, it's not any of those things. It's they're cursed. Um, but so Partridge is giving a reading that was I mean that reading is sort of traditionalist in the sense that correct me if I'm wrong, most Catholics and Protestants believe that.
Regarding the groupings and their
Mhm.
children to become the races, yes. When it comes to the curse of Ham specifically, and not just Ham being cursed by his son Canaan being cursed, but that all Africans inherit that in some sense. I believe there are reformed commentators, like I mentioned, that do reference that offhand. It's not really built upon in the structured way, and it doesn't really
Mhm.
get built upon into much of a structured way until you get into more modern times regarding people who are trying to defend American slavery and that sort of thing.
Right.
That's when it really gets drug up from the depths of history,
So you
and
think it was
and
instrumentalized for slavers to justify
yeah,
their
Essentially, yeah, I
practices.
think
Yeah.
that's probably accurate. I've drawn attention to this disconnect somewhat because what the historic commentators, both in Reformed tradition and Catholic traditions, I don't know about Eastern Orthodox, I don't study their stuff, but
Hmm.
both of the Catholic and the Reformed commentator traditions will talk about how the curse of Canaan was fulfilled in the destruction of the Canaanites and they're being driven out by the Israelites later. And so that's talked about a lot, that curse of Canaan. You may have other commentators that sort of offhandedly again mention that curse of Ham. It doesn't seem particularly instrumental, but then it becomes instrumentalized is a good word to use it later, even in our more recent history regarding a defense of slavery. And I've made the case before too, and I think Dale Partridge mentions in his sermon, I had clipped him earlier today, where
Hmm.
he talks about like it doesn't it'd be extremely strange for God to leave one branch of humanity unaddressed regarding that curse or blessing. But we have examples of this in Scripture because we've got David's sons where it's like God says the sword shall never depart from your house, and then
Hmm.
Solomon is loved by God and doesn't later leave his favor until he strays from the Lord. So as a Calvinist, as somebody who really puts a lot of emphasis on Christ's sovereignty, this idea that God isn't somehow able to curse a man by putting a curse on his son and not the rest of his lineage doesn't compute to me. That seems to be reading something on to God's character that's not found in the text. So that's really my argument against that reading. But there's going to be more people that are a lot more theological heavy hitters than I am that are now going to have to address this. And what's really funny is
Yeah,
that
I think that's fair.
we've gone so many generations without having pastors that have had to care about this topic.
Yeah.
um, because it just wasn't relevant until you get some random guy in a, unaffiliated church in Arizona stand up and through the internet reach hundreds of thousands of people and proclaim that he's bringing back this sort of doctrinal belief that most people had not thought about for 100 years, right? That's just a very odd modern phenomenon that the church is having to deal with.
Right. Unaffiliated. So are Joel and Partridge, they're as thick as thieves, right? They're like friends and
Yeah, they're all part
colleagues.
of yeah, they're part
And
of
are
Rebellion
they what
XR.
are they what kind of Protestant are they?
So they're both professing Uh, they're confessional reformed, which means they hold to, I believe it's the 1689 London Baptist Confession of Faith. I believe they both do. I know Webben does at least. I'm pretty sure
Mhm.
Partridge does. Um, but they are independent, so they do not have any higher presbytery structure. There's no polity that they are accountable to necessarily. Actually, Dale Partridge, from what I understand, had looked into joining Doug Wilson's denomination back a long time ago, and
Mhm.
Doug had sort of, well, I say Doug, I don't know who exactly killed it, but people within Doug's denomination, and Doug is really pretty high leadership in that denom, killed that process.
Okay.
So that's one of the reasons I kind of have a little bit more faith in Doug Wilson than some of these other guys is that I think he foresaw some of this coming and stopped it. But that is one thing that people have noticed is that these guys are all in their own little sort of unaffiliated bubble. You can't even attend Joel Webben's church if you want to because he meets somewhere that's not publicly like the information is not public. You have to be invited to his church. Um,
Oh,
it's
wow.
extremely odd. And I don't think Dale Partridge's is like that, but
Seems
I
kind
know
of
that Joel Webbins
anti-Christian,
is.
don't you think? I mean,
Well,
shouldn't your
yeah,
doors be
that's
open? I mean, yeah, I'm just
well,
saying. Yeah.
something that can get weird when you stress the covenantal points to the point of where they're silly is that you cease to be particularly evangelical, because it's
Right.
all about your family, your lineage, that sort of thing. Whereas historically reformed evangelical groups in the U.S. have held to a much more obviously evangelical perspective on church,
Mhm.
and so that's why people that have been in the faith for a while, especially even in evangelical circles, are noticing a very bizarre disconnect between guys like Webben and what we all sort of were historically on board with, even in just church structure and operations. So,
Right. I mean, it is something to be bringing these back. I think Partridge is talking now about uh Christian colonialism. Like we're going to do this for the Africans. We're not going to extract wealth, but we need to be in charge because of him.
right.
Um yeah,
Well,
very
funnily
very
enough, like
interesting.
you could take that in a paternalistic way that could be sort of even like an old South, um, U.S. thing.
Mhm.
Um, But the thing is, I don't feel like that really works with constantly denigrating them as a people on the internet,
Mhm. No, I
right?
understand.
That instinct, that sort of paternal instinct isn't, in my mind, particularly compatible with constantly spamming how much you have disdain for these groups of people, you know?
Right. Yeah, Ham was up to it again. Before we go, there's one other thing that I wanted to talk about, which was Hitler's uh, relationship with Christians and relationship with Christ. I guess you could say. I mean, it is the title of your Twitter account. So
That's
Hitler
right.
is Austrian. These these histories. Germany is mostly Protestant. There's Bavaria and some other places that are definitely Catholic. But Austria, it's a Habsburg state, Catholic. He was born a Catholic, baptized, I would assume, and grew up a Catholic. I don't, to the degree that I know a lot about his personal history, and I'm definitely not an expert. I mean, I don't see a lot of religiosity. I think he was much more interested in art and Wagner, so romanticism and so on, in his formative period. We have these things like the table talks that are secondhand memoirs of things he would say. Uh, in
You're gonna
terms
trigger
of,
me. You're gonna trigger me with the secondhand comment.
would you not? Do you think they're reliable?
Yeah, so I do
You
actually
do,
for a
yeah.
variety. Yeah, yeah. That is one of the biggest ones that is funny to me though, because the table talks are really a difficult one
I mean, they are
because
technically
they
secondhand, aren't they? The people would write down what he was talking about later. Isn't that correct?
yes, so firsthand
It doesn't mean
accounts
they're
being
unreliable, but
right, right, right. So that if you have if and my understanding of this is that firsthand accounts are accounts of the person that actually witnessed what was said.
oh, I
And those
see. That is
right, and so those
fair
would
point.
be
Yeah.
technically firsthand accounts. Now, being written later in the form of notes, and then Borman and Picker and these guys, getting together and making these notes collectively, that's an editorial question. But they
Mhm.
are, I think, my understanding is technically firsthand accounts.
Firsthand. That a
Um,
good point, actually. Yes.
Right. And one of the things
Um,
that I deal with a lot is and the main reason that I think they are reliable in conjunction with with Goebbels' diary and Rosenberg's is the amount of corroboration between them. So you have
mhm,
instances on the same recorded date of talking about the same topics. You've got extreme amounts of overlap between Goebbels and Rosenberg, where they record the same statements by Hitler. Again, these are notes, so you've got guys writing slightly different terminology, but nobody comes away from you know Hitler talking about, um, calling calling Christ's, Christianity a symptom of decay, right? Like the
mhm,
morality of the New Testament is a symptom of decay, and thinks, oh, this meant that he loved Christ, right? That's not.
mhm.
They all go off on their own and they record their own recollections of these conversations, which end up in the case of Goebbels in various different places, and same with Rosenberg, and then also the table talks through Bormann. And so,
And so
yeah,
you
I
think
I think they're
his
reliable.
yeah, yeah, no, yeah, you made a very good correction there. And also his dealings with German churches, both Catholic and Protestant, were simply a matter of pragmatism.
Absolutely.
You can't just become the Führer and
Right,
then wipe
right.
out all these institutions that are existing, but also where you have many people who supported him. I mean, particularly among Protestants, and there were Catholics as well. But it's interesting that Hitler was born a Catholic, and the whole thing got started in Bavaria, but it was actually more of the Protestants
Right.
that were voting for National Socialism in 1933, and there is a Prussian quality to House of Hohenzollern, the Prussian Germans that is you can see it's redolent of that. But there you had so many Christian supporters who did support him, and I don't want to compare. I'll say this: I don't want to equate Trump and Hitler, but because they're not the same, they're not literally the
Very
same. But
very Biden supporter move here, buddy. You're really, yeah.
right, right. But, there is there's similarities because it's like that Paula White thing. I mean, at the end of the day, Trump is a weirdly abstaining from alcohol, womanizing party hound who hung out with Epstein and all that kind of. He just is that. And it's just remarkable that you would choose him as a leader. I mean, I guess you could say, Constantine also wasn't a saint exactly. He did he had tremendous impact on the spread of Christianity, and you could go on with bad leaders who do good things. I get it. Regardless, there is still this bizarre quality of supporting him. And particularly with 2016, where his express doctrine was actually remarkably secular and a bit liberal. That's how they were criticizing him when he first announced. And at this point, he becomes a Christian leader very much like George W. Bush was, which I can remember pretty vividly, listening to talk radio in 2005 and people saying that God is on our side in Iraq and we're spreading the freedom around the world and God has placed his hand on George W. Bush and told him what to do. I mean, it was a remarkable time, and we have that again, though, with this George W. Bush was a saint in comparison to Trump. I mean, it's just it is very odd, but I guess you have to accept that if you're going to look at these periods of time seriously, whether it's Trump, age of Bush, age of Hitler, you have so many Christians who see their religion embodied in this leader.
Yeah, and I think so there is some aspect of that going on with Hitler in his rhetoric and his public statements. He would talk a lot about Christ as a fighter. His favorite story was, you could probably guess if you don't know
Turning over the
already.
changing tables, I would
That's right.
imagine,
He
or
loved that,
yes.
and there's this whole idea of that he carried a whip with him, and that it had
Right.
something to do with that, right? And so there's some of that going on. I I wrote, or I didn't write, but I made actually a brief video where I showed there's a research paper that was done, um, where they analyzed all the counties in Germany, and they looked at, before Hitler rose to power, before the NSDAP rose to power, with those initial votes. And they looked at each of the counties within Germany and how many people were naming their children Christian first names.
Mhm.
And then also how many of them were sending their children into either to become priests or pastors into the seminarian occupation background. And they took that to rank these counties by whether or not they were rooted in Christianity or a little bit more nominal. And I use nominal maybe differently than you've been talking about recently, but yeah.
Mhm.
Anyway, and the ones that were more nominal and less rooted actually showed to a statistically significant degree more support for National Socialism. And so
Mm.
I've used that as an example of where I think that there was this large liberalization and nominalization of Christianity within Nazi Germany, and a resurgence of Christian language that sort of awoke something in people through Hitler. But I believe it was empty rhetoric and not that didn't have any sort of solid theological basis, right? At least
Oh,
in
yeah.
Orthodox Christian praxis.
And you could definitely
Um,
see that with Trump as well. I mean, I would imagine the average person who goes to a Trump rally hasn't been to church in a while and maybe goes on Christmas or something. Like there is a sort of secular quality to them, but there's a much as with George W. Bush, where he'd put all these biblical phrases in his State of the Union address and so on. There's an ability to sort of call upon something that you heard once when you were a kid, like something buried in your memory that springs forth.
right,
And
right, and even
yeah.
down to Trump's cursing. I know that's kind of a weird one, but if
Mm.
you think about it, it's like in previous Bush and prior, conservative political figures in terms of evangelical support would not go out and use explicit language, and Trump did quite a bit on the campaign trail. I
Mhm.
mean, dude was hugging the pride flag in 2016. And
Yes. Yeah.
that was sort of, people were like, "Oh, that's kinda gross," on the evangelical side, and then they just kinda moved past it. But,
Yeah.
you know, he was so reactionary and the left was so vehement that it was very difficult to not get on the Trump train. And,
Mhm.
I think everybody sort of experienced that in 2016. I think in 2024, it was much more about COVID. But
Mhm.
we have seen much more of a theological resurgence, even in institutional conservatism, insofar as I've seen it, even in groups like Turning Point in the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, having Turning Point Faith now. I went to
Mhm.
America Fest in December, and it was wild to me how much more Christian this was than the Turning Point that I knew in college, when I was, in 2016.
Yeah.
It has shifted
Even
in that
Erica Kirk
direction.
is more of a pastor than a podcaster. It rhymed. In my she t well, she does more of these, like,
Right.
youth
Right.
pastory mega church, like, speeches than Charlie Kirk did, which is
Well, you might have
interesting.
noticed there was a very interesting, um, discourse around. This might have been the most in your face theological incident that I remember in my lifetime, maybe, was when Erica went up and forgave the killer of her husband.
Mhm.
And then Trump goes up afterwards and says, like, "Well, that's great for you, but, I
Right,
don't forgive him."
right.
And
"I
my
am a
area.
Sith Lord. We
Right, right,
never
exactly.
forgive." Yes.
My area of the intersection of evangelical theology and politics erupted.
Mhm.
It was just unbelievable how much, there was disparate, takes on this, because you have one side of people that were saying things like, "This is Trump being humble because he recognizes that, it would be a good thing to forgive, but he just can't do it, and he sees himself as a pitiful sinner." And it was like, and then there was another side of people that were like, "No, I think dude is actually just, it does not believe the gospel of Jesus Christ," And I was
Right.
more in that latter camp. I think that was
Yes.
him just, uh, I think he was almost kind of proud of saying that he was like, I'm I'm macho. I'm whatever, I'm
Yeah.
signaling that I am not going to forgive, right? I felt like that was the vibe I took away from that. But that sort of incident, I can't imagine ever happening because of some sort of TPUSA event 3 or 4 years ago. I
Mhm.
mean, that the fact that was even, something that Trump felt the need to address when he walked up on stage is just wild to me.
Mhm.
But anyway,
So, just in closing, what do you what do you think the future is of all this? Is the Joel Webbon, Calvin Robinson, Dale Partridge phenomenon, is this sort of an internet thing that's a fad that's going to go away? We've seen that a lot, of course. Or I mean, do you think, as I do, that actually this is the future? Maybe not of Christianity, but of politics. Wait, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm really bad at making predictions.
Mhm.
I've been telling everyone they need to sell Nvidia for like 3 years, so I don't know what I'm talking about in any regard with the future. But one thing that I do think is interesting is, like, if we look back at some of these figures and we see their journey, I the pipelines that I see Partridge, Webbin, whoever, going down, um, they're moving through it very quickly. They're moving
Mhm.
through it extremely rapidly. This is kind of what I mentioned earlier about how you'll find these guys coming out against racism broadly 2, 3 years ago, who are now saying racism is not a sin, racism is made up, racism isn't real, whatever, these sort of things, these statements now. Um, and I don't know what they will have to do to sort of continue to up the ante in regards to the rhetoric to keep people interested.
Right.
I don't think that they can go full Hitler, because I just don't think that people at large are going to tolerate that, even their fans.
Mhm.
So I wonder if what we're going to get is just they're going to sit sort of at this stage for a very long time and just remain reactionary. And
Mm.
I don't see why, if they're bringing in the cash, if they're bringing in, the money from pushing this kind of thing, I don't see why they really need to move beyond it immediately. I think that they moved through and they found the edge of the Overton window, and they're going to
Right.
just sort of sit there. as I don't see any of them coming out and going full Hitler. But I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't. I think the disconnect between the real life stuff and the online circles is just that's just too drastic to go beyond where they've gone. So
Mhm.
maybe I'm optimistic about it. I don't.
That's probably true. I would reiterate, not putting Calvin Robinson and company aside. I do think that the future of populism is going to be more religious, in maybe in an Erica Kirk like way, megachurch, millennial boss babe, and in a maybe a Trump way, although he has to leave the scene at some point. Maybe in a JD Vance way, maybe in a crude Curse of Ham way. I mean, I don't know, but I think that it's gonna. I think politics is going to become kind of post political in a way, and it's going to be its own culture and quasi religion.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of. I mean, the idea of politics as a quasi religion has been something that um, Christian theologians have been talking about for a very long time.
Hmm.
And it's not even statism, because a lot of the people that fall into this are not people who, they may be more people with, libertarian sentiment or temperament rather.
Hmm.
Um, but the idea of viewing political movements in a way that fulfills some sort of spiritual desire that you have, right? You go to a Trump rally and you get the feeling of like being at a worship service, right? You go
Yeah.
to you're a bunch of people all working together. I don't doubt that the Patriot Front guys, when they're sitting on the subway and they're so hyped to go through the turnstile and run up there and do whatever to save the homeland, I don't doubt that what they're experiencing is a thrill that they consider to be some sort of spiritual act on some level, right?
Yeah.
I don't doubt that. And as a Christian, I think that is not gonna go anywhere. I think that those people are going to be left, um, sort of in the dust of that. And one of the things that I've tried to do is have conversations with people that I feel like are sort of on the path to that ultimate, nihilism that comes with that, and redirect them to Christianity. That's really what I've
Hmm.
I've tried to do. So
Yeah. Well, that's good stuff. Well, why don't we do this? This was a great conversation, and I hope we can have some more conversations. This was an expression of brotherly love, coming across the aisle like Arnold when the black guy goes.
yeah, well, I do have some questions. I do have some questions for you, but I don't want to
Oh, well,
interrupt
you
your
can
Q
ask
and A or
him.
whatever.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
all right, yeah. So I know. I mean, I had posted a video. I had posted your Antichrist rant.
Hmm.
Maybe you have more than one. I don't want to. Maybe rant makes it sound too vapid or whatever. But
Yes, I was
you
enthused. Yeah.
you were very invigorated talking about the Antichrist a while back,
Hmm.
and one of the things that sort of struck me was I don't know, like I understand what you mean when you talk about the Antichrist in a very philosophical, heady way of like we want something that's the opposite of Jesus and this
Hmm.
will to power, almost Apollyon thing. I understand that as pie in the sky. Um, but you don't believe in Jesus, right? Like you don't do you are you only talking on the level of what
Yeah,
people
I'm
think
talking on a
Jesus is?
metaphorical level.
Just simply that.
I don't think Jesus existed. I think that the gospels are literature. Um and I also don't think he is God and the Son of God and he redeems you. So I don't believe in the Bible in the way that a Christian believes in the Bible. However, I also don't. I'm not like Richard Dawkins, and it's like the equivalent of a spaghetti monster in the sky. I think it is a tremendously impactful and complex work that has informed the minds of everyone who matters for 2,000 years. And I think there's also a lot of wisdom to be gained there. And so I feel like we sort of have to turn it on its head. I mean, Nietzsche had I think this might have been in the Antichrist book. It might have been somewhere else, but of Cesare Borgia on the seat of Rome. Because he exists in a Christian society. in order to transform it and transvaluate it, you need to sort of go at it and flip it on its head. So that's basically where I'm coming from. No, I don't think the book of Revelation is going to happen,
Sure.
next week or something, or there'll be 1,000-year reign in Jerusalem of a golden building, or I don't believe that that is true, but I feel like the metaphor is there and the metaphor is in everyone's mind. So we sort of have to think through the metaphor, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you're thinking about Christianity phenomenologically, really more
Correct.
than okay. Yeah, and that's I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting conversations to have there. I think that's a more serious way to look at scripture than the Dawkins perspective, as you sort of inferred.
Mhm.
Um, I yeah, I mean, I do. I mean, I am a Christian, so I believe it did occur. I weirdly
Mhm.
enough, the process of learning about historiography and really what it would take for me to consider accounts accurate, and applying that to the Gospels has really gotten me to the point of believing that they are authentic. That's a much longer conversation that I'm frankly not equipped to have with the right now.
Sure.
Um, but one of the things that has been interesting is I will run into guys who are will push the idea of Hitler as a Christian prince, and one of the primary ways that they have attempted to deny the
Mm.
premise of my account is by rejecting all of the sources that I use. And what is funny is that by doing this, they're sort of committing themselves to this extreme skeptic view of history, which
Mm.
I think at the same time as meaning that you reject all of my sources also commits you in a bizarre way to not being able to defend the gospels as historically reliable as well.
Mm.
Um, because if you are comfortable with the idea of grand conspiracy or whatever else,
Right.
you can very easily slot those exact same presuppositions into whatever form of mythicism or whatever you want to do. Not that that's the extent of faith or why people truly have faith. As somebody who's reformed, I think that faith is like a really a direct divine gift from God. I think that's
Mhm.
it doesn't come from our own. You don't sit down and you do the math. You don't build the
Right.
5G shape in your head and then it all connects and you've figured out Christ and achieved your salvation. That's not how it works, right? I as a Christian, I think that the Holy Spirit directly affects people and they encounter it. And
Mhm.
apologetics a lot of times are people that are trying to put into words the reason for why they find it reasonable. Um, but the basis for their belief is their election by God, right? That's my
Mhm.
my view.
Well,
So
you're a Calvinist, yeah.
that's
Wow.
that's right.
It's a harsh doctrine. Even if, I mean, wow. So it doesn't matter. You're elect or you're not.
Well,
Like,
in the sense that you can't do anything, but it's
right.
freeing in the sense that you didn't do anything to be saved, right? You can say,
Right.
God, I'm a sinner, I'm guilty, I'm worthy of hell. Um, if you save me, that's you. That's you that did
Mm.
that. It wasn't because I figured it out. It's not because there's anything in me that makes me worthy of salvation, right? Um, and this comes up in the idea of the book of life and Revelation of if you're written in there, you are, and that is a little bit freeing in regards to even the evangelical component, like we talked about earlier, because
Mhm.
it's not on you to having this conversation. It's not on me, Richard, that you come to belief in Jesus, that I walk you through the Roman road right now because if to make sure you figure it out. It's
Mhm.
it's up to the Holy Spirit, and I can pray for that, but it's not on the basis of what any man does that anyone comes to that faith.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a private conversation with two people, and Mark Brahman was actually there, and he was, if I remember correctly, he was saying things like, "Well, I think we should have a works doctrine as Apolloists. Like, it's the fame of a dead man's deeds, or you earned this through your abilities and your vigor and your stamina in this world." And it's funny because I understand, I totally understand where he's coming from, but and it is a kind of non-egalitarian way of thinking, but I I also I the Protestantism, I think it does strike me as compelling in the sense that there's actually nothing you could do to earn salvation,
Right,
and you're
right.
always bad. I and you, we've told a dozen lies today, you know, and we've lied to ourselves. We're sinning I've had some very lewd thoughts. Just speaking for myself, I've committed adultery many times today in my mind, and so you're kind of inherently undeserving. And I agree when you think of yourself as wretched, it can weigh you down and destroy your ego and all that kind of thing. But on another level, it there is a kind of freedom of like going to the floor and going through the floor and reaching the heights. To use a metaphor like that, yeah, if you understand what I mean, there is
Yes.
something compelling about it. You can't buy your uncle out of purgatory. There's no amount of money, you. And I do find the basic reformed message very compelling and authentic and sincere.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's interesting to hear from someone outside the faith, and I've heard that from others,
Hmm.
especially who have experienced some type of very in your face street preaching rhetoric that really implies, or conveys that they feel like they are the one that stands between you and hell rather than Christ, right? There's this sort of weird
Right.
this
Yeah.
weird vicarious thing where they're taking that almost to them for themselves in that moment. And there's terms that are used in some circles that like they'll call it soul winning, right? So it's like your evangelism is soul winning.
Hmm.
And I think there may be some basis for that use of language, and there's different levels of analysis for these sort of things. But in the more reformed tradition, that thought kind of rings to us as being as containing a lack of humility. Um,
Yes.
and
Well,
people
I
being as
remember my
infinitely
daughter one time asked me, she
complex.
was like, "So good people go to heaven?" And I was like, "Well, it's actually more complicated."
Was
It's
she
not.
asking you about in Christianity or in what you were
Yeah,
choosing
well,
for?
she didn't even say in Christianity that, she lives in America, in this
She
time,
just
and
imbibed it.
she's been
Yeah,
to church, yeah, many times. So she just
right.
asked, and I was like, "Well, actually, it's more complicated." Luther had this radical message, which is no one is deserving in a way. We're all bad is sort of the message. And
Right.
I think that was actually
So
a little bit too complicated for her at age 8 or whenever it was, but, um,
right, right.
I
Can I ask you a
fairly
question that
represented.
maybe can I ask you
Sure,
something kind of personal and you can tell me if it's too far?
that's fine.
So you mentioned like your daughter would go to church.
Uh-huh.
Do you I don't know how many kids you have or whatever. Have you raised your kids in the
I've
church
3 now,
or
yeah.
okay.
Yes, I think they need something to rebel against, don't you? Well,
You're so mainline, like you're so very yeah, Episcopalian. Yeah.
well, I do feel like there are, um, very good things about this, and I don't know. I've occasionally had conversations with other parents, and they were like, "Oh yeah, yeah, we never go to church. Neither Bill. I mean, I'm just using names. Neither Bill and I believe in God. And it's like I don't know. There's something kind of maybe there's something worse than the aggressive atheist, and it's the man who doesn't care. I think on some level
Right.
this was what Nietzsche was getting at when he talked about the last man. The last man knows that God is dead, and it's but it just goes on his life. It's like, oh yeah, God's dead, but there's a sale at Macy's. That's sort of the last man's attitude, and more to the last man than that. But I feel like you do, even if, because I'm a rebel, and and maybe they'll inherit that streak. You need some basis. uh, Even maybe she or my other two children will choose that, and that's fine. 'Cause I don't like forcing things on children. You know, you can influence them and lead them, but forcing, I don't like. And, but maybe they need that. Maybe they need something to rebel against, and they'll inherit my streak. But there needs to be something there. Like, there is something bigger than just going to school and buying something at Walmart and going to a baseball game. Like, there's something more to life than this. We're
Right.
humans are a religious species,
Well, you press
and I
Destiny on that as well, I think, because he made that point
mm,
about, we have was it I don't even remember, like, we have music, like, we can make music with our friends, and I feel fulfillment when I play video games, and you were like, "Really?" And, that was a good clip. I think that was a very valid critique of his sort of vapidness. Um,
I agree. Yeah.
one thing that I do, I mean, and this is kind of about, because I don't know a lot about your project with the Apollo and whatever
Mhm.
that's, stuff, but, are you authentically theistic?
I don't think an Apolloist would believe in the way that a Christian would believe. I think there's sort of two things going on uh, with Christianity. There is the pretense of historicity. We actually address this in the book and in the first book as well. There's a pretense of historicity that this really happened. And not just the Gospels, but Moses was a guy in Egypt once, and there was a Garden of Eden too. I mean, there is a this is historically true. I don't believe that readers of Hesiod would have that type of I don't know, like documentary feel when reading about Greek religion. I don't think most people thought in those terms. They took a myth as a myth. And the second thing about Christian faith is that you're doomed if you don't believe in it. I mean, you have to put your faith in Jesus or you're going to hell. And
Amen.
I right, yeah, no, I mean, and
Yeah.
so there are those two components, and they're sort of separate, but reinforcing one another. So I do believe that maybe on some level, a god is a kind of archetype or a state of being. You know, it's interesting with Venus or Aphrodite. She's not even ripped out of Saturn's belly. She comes out of the sea. She's almost this primordial principle of love and sex and fertility and other things all wrapped up into one. And, you know Mars when you are attacking someone. You might know Apollo when you're being particularly articulate and you're reaching clarity. I think you are Apollonian in that sense and in other senses. And so I think on some level there's this kind of archetypal state of being. And on another level, I think that gods are idealized forms of humans. They're superhuman. They can represent something, and Apollo is a polymath. They can represent these virtues, just incarnate these virtues in the sense that that image should be something that should lead the flock. So I don't believe that like Apollo talks to me or, or I'm gonna meet Apollo one day, or I don't really believe that there was an Apollo once. He was like an ancestor and he got exaggerated. I don't believe that either. I believe it more in the sense of a forward looking, creative, human creative capacity to create to invent an ideal. And so, in that sense, I believe.
Do you do you think that humans are uniquely capable of that on the basis of our material, like, what makes, as humans, and just the fact that we have the ability to think and have big brains? Or do you think that there's a spiritual, like a legitimately metaphysical quality, um, to people that is
The latter,
separating
like
us?
a psyche or soul. I mean, the latter. I guess I'm a kind of a materialist. Yeah, we have
Oh,
big
the latter or
brains.
the So
Or
the
I guess
first one. Okay,
the
okay.
former, excuse
The
me,
former.
yes.
Okay, gotcha,
Where
gotcha.
we have big brains and we think in this way, and religion
Right.
binds us. It's a way to bind a community and make you do things that you otherwise
Right.
wouldn't. Um, there's this I think there's this atheist saying, and Christopher Hitchens would quote this all the time, and he would say, maybe on occasion, religion can make a bad person good. A criminal goes to jail and he reads the Bible and he comes out and he gets his life together. Maybe that happens, but if you want to make a good person bad, you need religion. And I I know this. Well, that's why.
That's a very famous quote, yeah.
Right. But that is why we need religion. You need people to go over the top and rush into a barrage of machine guns. And we need to expand, we need to grow, we need to bind people without chains. And so I do think that religion is we've evolved with religion, and I do think religion is a human necessity in that sense. But
Okay.
I am a materialist in the sense that, psyche is often translated in Plato. When you see the word psyche, it's often translated as soul, and that definitely has a lot of Christian connotations there, the immortal soul and etc. There were many ancient mystery cults that were flirting with the idea of an immortal soul. Sometimes it was just a blessed afterlife, but some of them might have, we don't have that much documents from mystery cults, but some of them were pushing in the direction of an immortal soul. And certainly Plato thought in those terms, or Socrates, his mouthpiece. Um, but I psyche is mind, and yeah, we have a mind. I think that's a better
Right.
translation of that concept as it was meant at that
Okay.
point. But
Okay.
the
I hate
mystery
that I haven't read
cults.
your book. I feel
Well,
unprepared, I guess, because
send
I
you a
haven't read your
signed
book,
copy.
but
No, it's not out yet. I'll
oh,
send you a
okay.
signed copy. So well, yeah,
All right.
but
All right.
you know,
Are you I'll let you finish, sorry.
okay, but like mystery cults. Do you know the central god of the mystery cults?
No, this is not my area of
Bacchus,
expertise,
the
sorry.
god of wine. I mean, Plato is. I mean, from my perspective, Plato just invented Christianity, and he even invented a concept of heaven, which you can see in the Republic. He's saying, you know, whoa, I've read Homer, and Hades sounds terrible. You're a shadow of your former self, and you can barely do anything. Life is better than death. He was like, in order to defend the polis, we need to present the afterlife as wonderful and blessed. And Plato himself personally might have had some connection with Orphic cults, which are kind of post Dionysian cults. So, mystery cults, Plato, I think Christianity is this kind of ultimate modern synthesis of a lot of these different ideas that were floating around in the ancient world. And strict Apolloism is kind of like, at that time, at least, it's the mainstream that things like mystery cults or Plato were reacting against. They were trying to do something new and find something new. So in some ways, Apolloism is about trying to recover, to the degree that it's possible, an older form of religion, and how we can reinvent this for the future. I don't Apollos, we're total. The project at this moment, we're not. No one's worshiping anything. We're doing criticism and examining the Bible, etc. Now, at some point, there might be a strictly religious or worship component to all this, but we're not, anywhere close to that. But yeah, we want to uncover something that has been covered up over the past 2,000 years, but not just to reenact it, but to kind of direct it into the future for higher development of civilization. And Apollo is it. He is him for civilization in terms of beauty, intelligence, clarity, athleticism, health. There he is as our ideal. And so, yeah, that's how I would sum it up, as brief as possible.
Okay. and this is my own ignorance, I guess, on the historic cults that you're talking about and their perspective on these things.
Hmm.
You mentioned, the idea of those things being formulated with an end goal in mind of increasing civilization and, just dominance of the society.
Yeah.
Were they historically, who you're referencing, were they
Are you talking
moral
about the mystery
realists?
cults or Apolloist cults?
Apolloist cults, sorry.
Right. Well, these are state religions.
Right. What did they conceptualize, like, the idea of, um, man's dominance increasing as an objective moral good, or was this more conceptualized as a subjective personal preference for, um, like, just things getting better because 'cause it'll be good for me? Wa
I
was it
understand that.
either of
I don't know, but I
and then I guess what
I
would you
understand what
believe?
you're
Like, would
asking.
you say that that's, like, an objective, like, if you know what moral realism is, I've never been able to figure out in my very limited understanding of things like you're talking about at that level historically, how much the Greeks and Romans really conceptualized or had a understanding of moral realism, of the idea of moral values and duties that in and of themselves had intrinsic objective quality in the world.
Right.
Um, do you think they believe that? And then do you believe that?
So many of these gods are, quite literally virtues, and vices. I mean, there's a god called androgyny. Androgyny. I mean, so in some ways, these gods would sort of incarnate a virtue or a vice. Now, I guess I might be a little more of a historical relativist when it comes to morality, but then I am a materialist, so I do see
Right.
morality as
Right.
changing. Um, but I do think that the 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 artists that created religions knew what they were doing on some level. I would posit. Mark would posit this as well. Now, we could never prove this, but I do think that and whether they articulated it directly, who knows, or only thought it themselves, or it was a half of a thought or just a mere instinct. I do think that the artists who created all religions knew what they were doing, understood the power of religion, and wanted to change history with their religion. And so that the question is, what is the intention going on there?
Right.
To the
Why do you
degree that we can access it.
R Okay. So why do you think that, because that your interaction with Destiny on that was really interesting to me,
Mhm.
because I can sort of conceptualize that you were a materialist, and I've actually personally had a conversation with Destiny one time about how he's a moral anti-realist, and, I didn't know where you stood on this, on what that,
What
you know
what does that mean?
so
An
so,
anti he's totally moral
well,
in many
in the sense
ways.
that, and I guess there's always a gap between someone's philosophical beliefs and how they behave, right? Because everybody acts
Right.
as a moral realist in the sense that if somebody keys car, that you feel like that was wrong more than just
Right.
merely your preference for ice cream flavors, right?
Right.
People
Yeah.
understand that.
Yeah.
But philosophically, Destiny is a moral anti-realist, and he will say, like, I don't believe that moral values and duties have any more objective reality, than personal preference, because it's all materialist. It all happens in your brain. You're a meat puppet, right? Now
Right.
there may be, we can put
Morality is
names on that,
subjective, no doubt.
and that's,
But
so you would
it's
be,
more
would
than
you be
an
okay?
anti-realist. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying
Yes.
to figure out, because it
Yes.
seems like you have the
Realistic,
same
just for the audience's
materialistic
sake,
beliefs.
we're using the word realism in a way that they probably don't use it. So
Okay,
realism sort of as opposed to nominalism actually, that there are objective for all time moral principles that
right, right,
alive in the world. Yes. I am an anti-realist in that sense, but I think it's more it's deeper than just mere preference of ice cream. I think morality and
how?
collective morality can evolve and can make us better adapted to survival and dominance. So I don't think it's just merely a preference, like I like a white shirt as opposed to a brown shirt or something.
Okay, and that's okay, but it is still all within the material framework for you.
Correct.
Okay. And
Yes. Well,
that's
like
what was interesting with
Piranha.
Destiny, because that's his view,
Yeah.
but he's reached a form of anti-realism that I guess you don't want to just really,
Well,
I
I
guess,
think
anchor yourself to? I
Destiny,
don't know.
right? Destiny or Kyle Kalinske, I think what they have is a sort of non-aggression principle where you
Yeah.
can, it's all preference, but like you can be like crazy gay orgy
Right.
fan or whatever, but if like everyone is okay with it, then it's okay. Like I think that's what their morality is. There's
Well,
no like
in
assertion of what
politics
should be.
in
It's a kind
politics and
of
in
don't hurt
practice
anyone.
in politics and in practice it is, but on the philosophical level, he is a pretty firm anti-realist, and that's one of the reasons I actually have
It's
some respect for
interesting.
Destiny is I believe, and I hold to a form of apologetic background called presuppositionalism, but I
Mhm.
think that Destiny is really one of the most honest moral anti-realists that exist, in the sense that
Interesting.
it is bare naked desire and self indulgent hedonism, and
Right.
the thing is, and it may be extrapolated with incredible intelligence to the point of making arguments for how society should operate. You might even be able to, do the math to get to the point where you believe that we need religion, kind of like how you're talking about it, to get people to go up over the wall and run into the machine guns.
Yeah.
But when it all kind of boils down to it, it's like it's it's just a meat machine. And I think
Yeah.
that trying to preserve an aspect of that spiritual metaphysical thing that you're trying to describe with Apolloism is just not compatible with the materialist stuff. I just don't think it is. I think that it has to be rooted in some sort of metaphysic it is truly genuinely believed. And this is why things like the importance of Christ's physical resurrection
Mhm.
in Christianity, that it can't be reduced down to an assent to the idea that the story is impactful or makes people animated to do good things. Because if the moment that you believe that, you cease to truly act like it, right? Because that it was that it was cooked up in a lab to get you to go over the wall to run into the machine guns, right? You realize that, and so I think that's why the metaphysical component is just totally inseparable from spiritual claims.
I understand. I totally understand what you're saying. But yeah, and you could say I'm like a cynic, but I think Plato was a cynic. Plato wanted to change the world in a radical new direction and developed a philosophy of theory of forms to justify that. And he's had an impact for 2000 years. Not everyone needs to know. I mean, I know this sounds totally cynical and like
Yeah.
diabolical, but
Hyper Machiavellian, yeah. What we would call
yeah,
evil in Christianity. Yeah. No, I
right.
think it is. I think it is
Yeah.
evil.
But it also exists within society and flourishing. And I tried to mention the piranha, and people who listen to me a while are probably sick of this example, but it is a real classic example. The piranha are moral fish. They would never dream of eating another piranha. Never happened. Now, if an injured animal steps into that stream, it's another story. So there is a morality that is collective and no doubt heritable in terms of instinct and so on that encapsulates the group. And we might see them as evil, but they certainly don't see themselves that way. And I think not that we can, not that I'm trying to, or it's that easy to like change instinct on this level, but we respond to words and we respond to religion as if it were an instinctual command. And so changing that command is the trick. And I think that there are ways that we can start to change that command in the psyche of millions of beings on this planet and start channeling them into a new direction that would be better for mankind and culture and science and so much more. but you just sort of have to be willing to do it. I mean, Nietzsche complained, like, why haven't we had new gods in the past 2,000 years? I mean, you might say, "Oh, because there's
Because
only
we found the
one."
one and we found the one and we why
I get it,
make
I
more?
get it, but he would say it's a we've lost some creativity, some moxie, some guts to go out there and do it.
So do you see that the decline of Christianity as in your view, I guess in the West, or the increase of nominalism, theological nominalism in
Mhm.
Christianity, coinciding with the increase in greatness of science and going to the moon and all these things as being
100%.
okay, that those are truly derivative of each other, like that comes from that?
Yes. Now it's very interesting because Nietzsche had a view of Christianity, and he even associated with Plato. You can find this in the Gay Science, which is that
Great name
love
for
of
a book,
truth.
by the way.
Right, right. Not the other, yeah, not that book, not that one. The other Gay Science, yeah. Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft. But he that overvaluing of truth was at the heart of Plato and at the heart of Christianity. And he thought it ironically would overturn Christianity. So you love truth so much, you start engaging in criticism of the Bible. And high criticism in Germany, they were doing this. You start questioning whether Jesus was real, or whether, what are the contradictions in this dogma, et cetera. So, but it's that overvaluing of truth, truth at all costs, truth at the cost of my life. And so he saw, in a weird way, science as derived from Christianity, or at least that instinct to overvalue truth. Now, that being said, I absolutely don't. I think it's complex. I absolutely don't think we would have developed science without the nominalist revolution, because that questioning of the universal, Occam's razor, don't multiply universals, because we don't know these universals might not be real, they might be deceptive. God is not bound by universals, so don't multiply them. Just try to get at one. This seems to be the basis of the hypothesis. You can make a scientific hypothesis and begin testing individual instances to see if it is true. And so that nominalist revolution in mindset, I think, was absolutely foundational to the development of science and everything that comes with it. Yeah, the bicycle, the automobile, the space flight. Yeah.
So it's an
And
inheritor of
Protestantism.
what
Yeah.
you see as coming from the Platonic stuff through Christianity, but then we sort of outgrew it, is how you'd say, or do you think it's
Right.
owed initially at all to Christianity? Because I know that Tom Holland wrote a
It's
book about
complicated. I
dominion and
agree with what Nietzsche said, but I think nominalism in my mind is anti-Platonism. Plato is a realist. He didn't use that terminology, but that form is real. And keep in mind, the ideal couch is realer than the couch I'm sitting on right now. Like this chair, it's a chair actually. This chair is participating in the ideal form, and that's how I perceive it as a chair, and that's how it serves a purpose. So, what is Plato if not a realist?
see now now you're making so that's like a well, and then that's how you would get moral realism or whatever else, I guess, from that.
From Plato, yeah.
But it's not philosophical realism in the sense that what we the concept, like if all persons died tomorrow on this planet, the ideal of a chair also dies.
I would say that, but I don't know.
Yes. Well, and that's
Plato
that's
probably wouldn't say
anti-realism,
that.
right?
Yeah. Like
Yeah.
there's a
Well, and
nuclear
I think
war,
Plato was
but
right and you're wrong.
exactly, yeah. Like there's a
Yeah.
nuclear war, but like chairness still exists.
Right,
It's kind of
chairness
funny to
remains
think
even
about that,
though
but yeah,
nobody is around. Yeah, I mean,
right.
I would say it does. I mean, but I think that extends to moral properties and values as well, and the fact that people
Wow.
instinctually understand those to be true. So I think that the difference between physical realism of objects and things like that and moral realism, I think the same arguments that can be made for any type of realism can also be extrapolated to be arguments for moral realism.
Right.
The only issue is we can physically see a chair and we can't physically see the fact it's wrong to rape children, not in the same
But we
sense,
can
right?
though. But we can't. This is my rejoinder to that is we can though because
Maybe we want to
a
change the analogy so this doesn't get real wacky here in
well
a second.
no I understand like
Right, right, right.
we can't don't be depraved, but a depraved society is going to die on the vine. We need uh, we need to cooperate. We need to be good. We need to treat everyone with good faith and as brothers
Right.
in
If we
order for this
presume
society
that
to dominate and survive in the first step, but dominate
with
in
the
the second step.
presumption that us continuing to survive is a good, right? So that's all. I
Right.
mean, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, I know we've gone down the rabbit hole, and I want to keep you all night or whatever, but this has
Well,
been very
no,
interesting.
this has been very philosophical. I think we've also kept it on a level. It's hard to complex ideas are they're hard. It's not that the idea is hard; it's explaining it is actually hard. You know what I mean? Like ideas are kind of
Sure.
simple, but it's a struggle to explain it, and I think we have done that. So I think the audience benefits from that.
Cool. That's
Yeah,
that's awesome. So I
we're
one
not
thing I
navel
was
gazing. Is what I'm saying.
right. I don't think we're just smelling our own farts over here. Yeah. One thing that I wanted to ask you, um, because I think it was Scott Greer I was talking to, and I know you and
No,
Scott are on the outs for whatever reason. I don't really care to
right,
get into that,
right.
and I don't know or want to know. But he wrote an article that was like why I'm not a white nationalist recently,
Uh huh.
and I thought that was a very interesting article and encapsulated as somebody who has never, a white nationalist, but I feel like I understood a lot of their beliefs and why they believed them or believe them still. Um, why he left that movement or stopped labeling himself as that. And I was curious if you still consider yourself a white nationalist or where you stand in regard to that. Is it do you just dislike the label? Do you still see the sort of platonic ideal as being a singular ethnic or racial nation? What's your feeling?
I've definitely left the movement. I mean, I don't even talk to anyone from from 10 years ago. I actually did know Mark Brahman 10 years ago. There is he, but other than that, I'm out, and they don't like me either, so it's fine. I also don't really like the label, and I also think it sort of like binds you in a way that I don't really care for. It's like we're sticking up for the whites here. I don't know. I think we should criticize the whites here, and we should do. I'm doing things that will no doubt be offensive to most whites, certainly all white nationalists. So I don't really think of myself as like an advocate or or whatever. I mean, I think I don't know if I read the article, but I did read a tweet by Scott Greer where, I mean, talk about cynical. I mean, my sense of what he was saying was that people don't like the term white nationalist, so I don't use the term white nationalist. And it's better not to be part of a white nationalist movement because Trump furthers the goals of white nationalism. Isn't that the thesis of his book?
Yeah, I've not read his book. I'm supposed to.
Yeah.
I'm going to get a copy of it. I'm supposed to go to his. He's having a book party, I think, and I may go to that.
Hmm.
But
I didn't get an invite. That's crazy.
well, I listen. I don't know how good you guys are friends or not or whatever, but
No, I
um,
haven't spoken to him in
yeah,
a while,
we
but,
chat
yeah.
and I think some of the stuff that I've pushed on, he's pushed on as well online, and
Yeah.
I think that was essentially. I mean, it's a little bit uncharitable, but I do think that was the general flow of his article. But I think really what I read in it was, and this is the article, not his book, but I think it's a similar
Mhm.
premise, was that he became disenchanted with white nationalism kind of because he realized not just that it wasn't achievable pragmatically, but that he wasn't quite sure he wanted to live in the fantasy world of these weird internet freak people um, that they were dreaming about. That's kind of what I felt he was somewhat communicating in that. And I think that the language that you use in some of these circles to communicate that is the pragmatism.
Mhm.
But I felt there was sort of a deep sense of like maybe the wheat fields and the blonde Aryan harem or whatever. Maybe that
Right.
actually is just very silly, and I don't think I would want to live in pre-Christian Europe, right? I don't know,
Right.
but that was sort of the vibe that I get from him, and so I
You
see
might be projecting
similarities.
that into what he said, but I
Maybe,
agree with
maybe I
that
am.
sentiment. I agree with that
Okay,
sentiment, though.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. So as you guys, at least on that level, maybe are
Yeah, I
on
know.
the
I mean,
same
the
page.
funny thing is that there's a lot of agreement. Yes.
Yeah. So you've never done the "I'm not a white nationalist anymore" speaking circuit where you go talk to NPR.
No,
You haven't.
I was talking to this journalist about that, and he almost wanted me to, and it's like I just I'm not gonna go and wash people's feet or like say that I was totally wrong because I don't think I was totally wrong. And I can parse out where I was wrong or where I've moved where I disagree with myself and also where I'm just headed in a different direction, which is obvious. But just this like I'm here, I'm a liberal now. I'm sorry. Does anyone I guess some people want me to do that. Whenever I see people do that, I don't trust them. Lucas Gage, I don't trust that I don't trust him as far as I could throw him. I don't like that. I don't demand that of other people. Like I just don't like that whole thing. And like if you reconverted to Apolloism, I'm gonna do the Islam thing, you reconverted. Yeah. But if you reconverted to Apolloism, you don't have to apologize to me or like get at my feet and I was wrong. I'm so sorry. You don't have to do any of that. Like I sort of respect people where they are. I don't think I'm not 180 degrees away from where I was, but I am in a different place. You want to find out where I am, you can listen to me. But I'm not gonna come and go on this apology tour and say I'm sorry and I'm wrong and I want to say, it's like I think the best way is to go forward and be productive as opposed to like wallow in, you know, the past. Or for Lucas Gage, I'm so sorry about what I did last month or some,
Right. I mean,
I don't know.
and that was extremely rapid, which is why that was so odd. But yeah,
Right.
I mean, there's definitely an aspect of it that could be self-denigration, and I'm not. I don't think there's any degree of this that, based on your background, that I would ever expect you to do, especially because you're not a Christian. So I understand your value system on what that would even look like is totally out the window. But I do think, so I'm from Texas, right? And I knew a lot
Hmm.
of people at Texas A&M, and you
Hmm.
went to Texas A&M in a very dramatic fashion when I was in college, I think.
Wow.
And I remembered this, and I think I even at the time I like tweeted at you one time because I tweeted at some event where I'd asked a question about free speech and I'd added you or whatever way back then.
Uh-huh.
And this is when you were very vehement in this stuff, very very hardcore
Yeah.
on it. And I think one of the things that's weird about the internet is it takes a person in time, and then that's how you are remembered is that specific action that you took that got attention at that point, and then
Yes.
it's frozen, right? In a
Yes.
way that memories are not, because people reinterpret memories, but they can't reinterpret you throwing up a Roman at whatever event.
And I
I think
didn't
after
even
that.
throw up a Roman, but you remember it
Oh,
that way.
I'm
Wait,
sorry.
yes.
I'm sorry. That's
I
what I remember. Did you
raised a
not throw a
glass. Yeah,
Roman? What did you
I didn't. I
Oh,
raised a glass, but there were some Romans thrown in the room. So yeah,
there were some
it
Romans
right.
thrown.
Can you ever, can I or anyone ever escape their own shadow? Am I just Bill Buckner? Bill Buckner was like a really good baseball player. Do you know who Bill Buckner is?
No, no, I didn't.
Okay.
Sorry. Not a
So
sports guy.
1986 World Series, Red Sox versus Mets. The ball goes through his legs in the ninth inning, and the Mets win. It's the most infamous play ever. And this guy had a life. He was actually great. I think he won a batting title. Or he had a whole story. There's ball going through his legs is the one
Right.
thing that he is known for. It just is what it is. I think the only like I could go and be like, I was wrong. I'm sorry. Maybe that would be most effective, but it's just not something I can do personally. I think a better thing is to say, like, I am going to be productive. I'm going to go after the truth. I am going to help you understand things. I'm going to be good. And I just think that's the better thing to do than an apology tour. No one would believe me. People always think I'm kind of evil.
Well, you're
I don't know. Is
Machiavellian,
it the
so I was about to
mustache?
say, I mean, even when you just mentioned a second ago, you said, you're like, "I just raised a glass," and in my Puritan sensibilities, I was like, "Oh, yeah, he's probably telling the truth," and then I was like, "Well, hold on, I don't have any reason to believe that Richard is telling me
Right.
the truth right
Right.
now either." I mean, based on all the presuppositions here, I don't know. This could be some
No,
Machiavellian
I am being truthful there.
play.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, you
I
said it
don't think
again, so I
anyone
guess
would
I believe
believe
you
me if
now.
I don't think anyone would believe me if I did it though. I
Lied
genuinely
that
don't.
blatantly, right. I
Yeah.
understand, I understand. Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
cool, yeah. Well, that's pretty much the only things I had on my list,
Well, this
that
is
I wanted to
great.
mention.
I am very pleased with that. We had a number of viewers, and I think I'll put up the whole thing on YouTube because this was out here for free and stuff like that. So this was an excellent talk. I really enjoyed it and gained something from it. Why don't you tell our listeners and everyone where they can find you? And are you publishing on Substack now, or you just have an account? Or
Yeah. No, no, I've been on Substack for a minute,
good.
so you can my s if you do hitlerhatedchrist.com, it takes you directly to my Substack, and that is mostly gonna be historical material, so that's gonna be World War II, stuff related to Christianity and Nazism and their intersection. I published earlier this week, a contemporary SS, internal document, just for as an example, where they were discussing, really sort of like a game plan for how they were going to reformat the church, and we're pretty open about their plans and that sort of thing. So if that interests you and you're curious about that topic, that's where I put most of that stuff. And then for just on stream of consciousness and goofing off type stuff, I'm on Twitter at not our guy with underscores between each word. I've got a YouTube channel. I do some content on there. My best thing on my YouTube, I have a 3-hour video where I do a full breakdown of a lot of the really just F tier, low IQ Holocaust denial crap that's out there. And I go through an entire podcast by one of my interlocutors, and that took me about a year to make it. So if you guys are interested in
Wow.
that kind of topic, I think that may be the most comprehensive dealing with really all of the historical revisionism in that regard that I've found. And I made it. So if you're interested in that, that's on there too. So
Very good stuff. I'm actually going to be in Texas next week, so maybe I'll buy you dinner or something. Who knows?
well, we'll talk maybe after we end the stream here because maybe
Definitely,
we'll be in the
definitely.
same place. I don't know.
That sounds fun. Well, anyway, thanks everyone for being here, and I will see you soon. Ciao. Thank you.